She married a ruthless king, but what he did on their wedding night made her break down. Welcome, dear listeners, to a journey through time. Before we begin, I'd like to know, where are you watching from? Leave your city in the comments. And if you appreciate stories that touch the soul, stories from distant eras that echo eternal truths in our hearts, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Your support helps us continue to bring these moving narratives to you. Today we dive into a story set more than 6 centuries ago, in a time when stone castles guarded secrets whispered by the mountain winds, and human hearts beat with the same intensity they do today. It is a story about a young woman who became a queen not because of the crown she received, but because of the courage she carried. About a king who learned that true strength lies not in the sword, but in the capacity to let oneself be transformed by love. And about how even in the darkest times, the light of hope can break through the most impenetrable walls. Prepare your heart, for this is a narrative that crosses time to remind us that true nobility lies not in blood, but in the dignity with which we face our destinies. Year 1387, Kingdom of Blackmore, Northern England. June arrived at Castle Thornwick carrying the smell of dry earth and the promise of another summer without rain. Margery of Ashford was in the East Tower when she saw the golden dust rising from the distant road, the inevitable arrival she both feared and expected. At 21, she knew the weight of responsibilities that fell on delicate yet firm shoulders. The hot wind blew through the narrow windows, making the red locks escaping from her embroidered veil dance. Down below, in the fields that were once green, the wheat was dying of thirst. 3 lost harvests, 3 years of unanswered prayers. The empty granary echoed like the stomachs of the peasants who depended on it. Her father, Lord William, had negotiated for months. 500 barrels of grain, exemption from taxes for 5 years, soldiers to protect the borders against the bandits, who multiplied like crows over corpses. And in return, her Margery, a daughter offered as currency in a deal that would save hundreds of lives but would cost all of her freedom. King Edward of Blackmore, the Iron King as he was called in taverns and whispered about in chapels, a man of 37 who had conquered his throne through war and maintained it through fear. They said he hadn't smiled since becoming king 15 years ago, when his father was killed in a Scottish ambush. They said he executed traitors personally, that his hands were stained with the blood of nobles who dared to conspire against him. They said his heart was made of the same black stone as the mountains where he had built his fortress. But Margery didn't believe everything they said. She believed in facts. And the fact was that her people were starving, while she remained comfortable within the walls of Thornwick. The fact was that an entire village had been abandoned at the last new moon. The fact was that she had spent years studying Latin, French, canon law and philosophy, not to decorate halls, but to govern when necessary. When she descended to the main hall, she found her father before the fire that burned even in the summer heat, a fire lit more out of habit than necessity. He held a parchment and his hands trembled slightly. It wasn't fear, Margery knew. It was age arriving like a silent thief. "The king's reply has arrived," William said without looking up. "He accepts the terms." Margery approached, feeling the heat of the flames against her face. "All the terms, father, including the clause I insisted on including?" William finally looked at her, and there was pride in those tired eyes. "All of them. You will maintain a voice in Ashford's affairs. You cannot be repudiated except for proven treason." He signed. It was a small victory, but a significant one. In a world where women were bargaining chips, Margery had insisted on not being just a piece on the board, but a player with rights guaranteed by contract. It wasn't love, it wasn't choice, but it was dignity. "When does he arrive?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "Tomorrow at noon. He will bring his full retinue and the first shipments of grain." William paused. "Daughter, there is still time to—" "There is no time for anything but what must be done." Margery touched her father's shoulder. "You taught me that to govern is to bear the weight of difficult decisions. This is my decision." That night Margery couldn't sleep. She stood at the window of her chambers, watching the stars that blinked indifferently over the thirsty kingdom. Edith, her servant since childhood, had laid out the blue silk dress she would wear the next day on the bed. A wedding dress with no engagement party. Fair queen's dress without a crown yet. She thought of her mother, who died in childbirth when Margery was only 7. She thought of the stories she heard as a child, of princesses rescued by shining knights. But real life had no shining knights. It had iron kings and marriage contracts. It had hunger and duty. And it had her, preparing to save her people the only way she could. When the sun rose over Thornwick, bringing another dry, hot day, Margery was already dressed and waiting. Her red hair had been braided with white and blue ribbons. Her dress fell in perfect folds. Her face was serene, a mask of calm that hid her racing heart. And then, at noon, when the sun was at its highest and most merciless, she heard the sound of horses and armor. The Iron King had arrived to claim his bride. The royal retinue entered the gates of Thornwick like a storm of steel and power. 100 knights in polished armor, with black and silver banners fluttering in the wind. The Raven of Blackmoor, symbol of a kingdom forged in war. 10 heavy wagons followed behind, laden with sacks of grain and chests of gold that shone under the unforgiving sun. At the head of them all, mounted on a black destrier named Tempest, rode the king. King Edward of Blackmoor was a figure who seemed to have been carved by war itself. Tall, with broad shoulders that carried the weight of 15 years of rule and countless battles. His dark brown hair, almost black, had silver threads at the temples, and a deep scar cut across his face from his left temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of some violent confrontation he had survived when others had not. Marguerite watched from the top of the stone staircase beside her father. Her heart pounded, but her face remained serene. She had learned long ago that the true power of women lay not in hiding their emotions, but in choosing when to reveal them. Edward dismounted in a fluid, precise movement. Even without armor, dressed only in a black tunic embroidered in silver, he emanated a presence that made the air feel heavier. 2 men accompanied him closely, Sir Geoffrey of Vale, his military commander, and Lord Edmund Hartwell, the royal treasurer. William descended the stairs to greet the king, and Marguerite followed him with measured steps. But when they reached the courtyard, Edward addressed only her father as if she were just part of the castle's decoration. "Lord William," Edward said, his voice deep and controlled, "the terms have been accepted. The grain is being unloaded as agreed." "I am grateful, Your Majesty," William replied. "Ashford is in your debt." They continued talking about logistics, about soldiers, about taxes, and at no point did Edward look at Marguerite. She felt a spark of irritation light in her chest. She didn't expect to be treated like a fairy tale princess, but to be completely ignored was a different kind of insult. When there was a pause in the conversation, she took a step forward and spoke in perfect Latin, citing a passage from canon law. "Matrimonium consensu, non coitu perficitur." Marriage is made by consent, not consummation. The silence that followed was as thick as the dust rising from the dry fields. Edward finally turned to her, and his eyes, blue-grey like steel, assessed her with an intensity that made Marguerite feel she was being measured, weighed, and judged in a matter of seconds. "You know canon law, Lady Marguerite?" There was something in his voice she couldn't identify. Surprise, perhaps, or reluctant respect. "I know enough to know that my consent is required by law, Your Majesty, and I'm here to declare that I give it freely." She held his gaze steadily. "Within the agreed-upon terms, including the clauses that protect my voice in the affairs of Ashford." For a moment, that seemed to stretch for hours, they stared at each other. Marguerite saw in those cold eyes a sharp intelligence and something else, a profound loneliness, as if he had built walls not only around his castle, but around himself. "Adequate," Edward said at last, and the word fell between them like a stone in a well. Not beautiful, not desirable, adequate, but there was something else in that look, a recognition. She would not be a docile, silent wife, and he knew it. And maybe, just maybe, that didn't displease him as much as she had imagined. The banquet that night was a demonstration of formal courtesy. Marguerite sat to Edward's right at the high table, while musicians played songs that seemed out of place in the tense atmosphere. He drank moderately. She noted he never allowed himself to lose control, and spoke little, constantly observing the hall like a hawk watching the field. "Your father is a man of honor," Edward said suddenly without looking at her. "Few nobles would have the courage to negotiate protective clauses for their daughters." "It was not my father's courage, Your Majesty. It was my insistence." For the first time she saw a flicker of something that might have been. Genuine interest crossed that severe face. "Then you are more astute than most ladies of the court." "Astuteness is necessary when one governs, not when one merely decorates halls," Marguerite replied. "And I intend to govern at your side, not just serve as an ornament." Edward studied her for a long moment. "Then you will have the opportunity to prove your usefulness." It wasn't a compliment, but it wasn't a refusal either. It was a challenge. And Marguerite, who had never backed down from a challenge, felt a fierce determination ignite in her chest. This Iron King would discover that she was forged from the same metal, perhaps even stronger. The retinue departed from Thornwick at dawn on the 3rd day. Marguerite travelled in a litter covered with dark blue velvet curtains, accompanied by Edith and Lady Beatrice, Edward's cousin and the only female presence at the royal court. Beatrice was 32 and had a look that seemed capable of reading souls. "He is not cruel for pleasure," Beatrice said on the first night when they stopped at an inn, "just absent, as if a part of him died along with his father and he never learned to live again." Marguerite absorbed these words in silence. She had spent her life observing people, learning to read between the lines, and was beginning to understand that the Iron King was not simply a tyrant, but a man who had learned to survive through hardness. On the second day, they were crossing Grimwood Forest when the attack came. Bandits, desperate men whom hunger had turned into wolves, emerged from the trees like shadows. Marguerite heard the shouts, the clash of metal on metal, and pushed aside the litter's curtains to see. Edward fought like a force of nature. Every move was precise, economical, lethal. There was no hesitation, no mercy, just the brutal efficiency of a warrior who intimately knew the dance of death. In minutes, the ambush had been repelled, the bandits dead or fleeing. When silence returned to the forest, Edward approached the litter. His face was splattered with blood that was not his own, but his expression remained impassive. "Are you wounded?" he asked. And for the first time, Marguerite heard something beyond indifference in his voice. Concern, perhaps, or responsibility. "I am unharmed, Your Majesty." He nodded, already turning away, but she called out to him, "Your Majesty, thank you for your protection." Edward stopped, looked back. "It is my duty to protect what is mine." Cold, pragmatic words. But they were honest, and Marguerite was beginning to value honesty above any empty kindness. At the inns where they stopped at night, Edward tested her. He asked about theology, about military strategy, about the laws that governed kingdoms. They were harsh conversations without flourishes, and Marguerite realized he was evaluating not her beauty or her manners, but her mind. "If a vassal lord rebels but is right in his grievances, how should you proceed?" he asked one night. Marguerite considered carefully. "Justice without mercy is cruelty. Mercy without justice is weakness. I would hear the grievances, correct the errors if they are legitimate, but punish the rebellion proportionally to establish that there are proper channels to seek redress." Edward observed her for a long moment. "Adequate," he said again, but this time the words sounded different, almost like approval. On the fourth day, the Black Mountains appeared on the horizon, and with them the fortress of Ravencross. Marguerite stepped out of the litter to get a better look, and what she saw took her breath away. It was not a palace, it was a statement of power. 3 rings of black walls, towers that seemed to pierce the low clouds, iron gates that could withstand entire armies. "Impressive, isn't it?" Beatrice said beside her. "It was built to never fall, and in 15 years under Edward it never has." Marguerite looked at the fortress that would be her home and felt a chill, not of fear but of understanding. This place had been built by a man who trusted only in stone and steel, a man who had learned that even people could betray him, but walls would remain firm. And she, Lady Marguerite of Ashford, would have to find a way to cross walls much higher than those of stone, the ones Edward had built around his heart. The 24th of June, the feast of St. John the Baptist, dawned with a grey and heavy sky as if the clouds themselves carried the weight of this union. The Cathedral of St. Mary in Ravencross was packed, 300 nobles and knights all in their finest attire, but the atmosphere was as solemn as a funeral. Marguerite wore a dress of white silk imported from Flanders, so pure it seemed to glow in the cathedral's gloom. Her lace veil fell to her waist, and a simple silver circlet rested on her carefully braided red hair. She was beautiful in that moment, not with the frivolous beauty of court ladies, but with the serene dignity of a queen who knew the weight of the crown even before wearing it. Edward waited at the altar, dressed in ceremonial armor of polished steel that reflected the candlelight. A black cloak embroidered in silver fell from his shoulders. He looked exactly like what he was, a warrior king forged in battle, who saw this ceremony as just another political strategy rather than a sacred sacrament. Bishop Anselm conducted the ceremony in Latin, his voice echoing in the Gothic vaults. Marguerite answered each question with a clear, firm voice, without hesitation. When it was time for the vows, Edward declared, "I take this woman as my queen," and Marguerite, holding his gaze, replied, "And I take this man as my king and lord, under the eyes of God and the law." The bishop hesitated. Those were not the traditional words, but Edward gave an almost imperceptible nod, allowing it, the first sign that he respected strength, even when it came from his wife. The feast that followed was grand but joyless. Roasted boars, swans prepared with their feathers restored, French wines that flowed like rivers. Edward drank little, as always, and watched the room with those blue-grey eyes that never rested, always calculating, always assessing invisible threats. Marguerite noticed something in that constant gaze. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. He had learned the hard way that trust was a luxury kings could not afford. As the night wore on and the guests finally retired, the ladies led Marguerite to the royal chambers in the main tower. They bathed her in perfumed water, dressed her in a fine linen nightgown, and brushed her red hair until it shone like polished copper. Lady Beatrice was the last to leave. "He is not cruel for pleasure," she repeated, echoing her words from the journey. "Just protected, but stone can be worn down by water given enough time." It was the closest comfort she could offer. Marguerite was left alone in the room that was now hers, listening to the wind howl between the towers. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. And then the door opened and Edward entered. He had exchanged his armor for a simple tunic, but his presence still filled the space like that of a predator. He approached her, then stopped. For a moment something crossed that severe face. Hesitation, uncertainty, emotions that seemed foreign on him. "Did you consent to this marriage?" he asked abruptly. It wasn't delicate conversation, but it was honest. Marguerite faced him. "I consented to duty. I was not given a choice of the heart. Neither was I." The words came out low, almost like a confession. It was the first admission that he too was a prisoner of circumstances, bound by responsibilities he had not chosen. What followed was respectful but without passion. Edward was careful not to hurt her physically, but there was no tenderness in his touches. It was a transaction completed, a duty fulfilled, a contract sealed in the way that law and tradition required. Afterward, he did not pull away immediately as she expected. He lay beside her in the dark, and in the silence that stretched between them, he asked, "Did you cry?" "No," Marguerite lied, discreetly wiping away a solitary tear that had escaped. "Good." A long, heavy pause. I'm not a kind man, Lady Marguerite. War leaves no room for kindness. But I will be just. That I can promise." It was the first genuine vulnerability he had shown. It wasn't love nor affection, but it was honesty. And in that moment, lying next to a stranger who was now her husband, Marguerite realized something important. Edward of Blackmore was not simply an Iron King. He was a man who had learned to turn himself into iron because everything else had failed to protect him. And maybe, just maybe, iron could learn to feel warmth again, if the flame was persistent enough. The first few months in Ravencross were like living inside a fortress that had never known laughter. The black stone walls seemed to absorb any warmth, and the corridors echoed only with the hurried steps of servants and the distant sound of soldiers training in the courtyard. Marguerite woke up alone most mornings. Edward left before dawn to train with his troops or shut himself in council meetings that lasted for hours. He was attentive in practical matters, ensuring she had everything she needed, answering her questions when she dared to ask them. But there was a distance between them, vaster than the mountains surrounding the castle. But Marguerite was not a woman to waste time lamenting what she didn't have. If she didn't have her husband's affection, she would have his respect. She began to ask to attend the council meetings. "Why?" Edward asked when she made the request for the first time, his eyebrow raised in genuine surprise. "Because I was educated to govern, not to embroider pillows. And in the marriage contract, you guaranteed my voice in the affairs of Ashford. How can I maintain that voice if I am ignorant of how your kingdom functions?" Edward studied her for a long moment, that piercing gaze seeming to see through masks. Finally, he nodded. "You may attend, but only attend initially." It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Marguerite sat silently in the meetings, watching Edward negotiate with lords, resolve disputes, plan defenses. She absorbed everything, the names, the alliances, the unspoken tensions. And she noticed something the men around the table didn't. Edward was a brilliant military strategist, but he neglected civil matters. Roads in ruins, disputes over water, small injustices that fermented resentment. One autumn morning, a dispute between two lords over water rights came before the council. The argument had been dragging on for hours, and Edward was visibly impatient. Before she could stop herself, Marguerite spoke. "The solution is in the Digest of Justinian. Roman law establishes that running water is a common good, but it can be diverted as long as it does not harm third parties. Fair measurement and a rotating irrigation system." The silence that followed was deafening. Lord Edmund blinked in surprise. Sir Geoffrey arched an eyebrow. And Edward. Edward looked at her with something she had never seen before in his eyes. Genuine interest. "Implement the Queen's solution," he said simply and moved on to the next matter. After that day, Marguerite's presence on the council ceased to be merely decorative. Edward occasionally asked for her opinion, especially on matters involving law, agriculture, or civil disputes. She never wasted her interventions, speaking only when she had something substantive to contribute. And slowly, very slowly, she began to earn the respect not only of Edward, but of the men who served him. But respect was not closeness. At night, when Edward came to their shared chambers, he fulfilled his marital duties with the same efficiency he commanded troops. Respectful but distant, as if there were an invisible wall between them that neither knew how to cross. Marguerite explored the castle in her free afternoons, and that was how she discovered the walled garden. Hidden behind the west tower, it was a small but carefully maintained space with old rose bushes and aromatic herbs. There was a stone bench under an apple tree, and it was there that Marguerite went when the loneliness weighed too heavily. It was Beatrice who told her the story. It was Edward's mother's garden. She died when he was 12. No one else goes in there except the old gardener, who keeps everything exactly as she left it. Marguerite began to go to the garden every day, sitting on that stone bench, imagining the woman who had planted those roses, who had chosen those herbs, the mother of a boy who would grow up to become the Iron King. She wondered if that boy had been different, if he had laughed and played like other children, before life taught him that tenderness was weakness. One day in early winter, Marguerite was in the garden when she heard footsteps. She turned and found Edward standing at the entrance to the walled garden, motionless as a statue. His face was tense and she couldn't decipher his expression. "I beg your pardon," she said quickly. "I didn't know this place was private." "It is not private," Edward replied, his voice strangely hoarse. "Just forgotten." He entered the garden slowly, as if each step was painful. He approached a specific rose bush, touching its petals with surprisingly gentle fingers. "My mother planted this one." She said red roses symbolized love that survives the winter. It was the first time he had spoken of his mother, the first time he let any true emotion show. Marguerite remained silent, knowing instinctively that words would be wrong in that moment. "She died a little each day," Edward continued, still not looking at Marguerite, "and I was just a boy, unable to do anything but watch. When she finally left, I swore I would never be so powerless again. That I would never again let something precious slip through my fingers. And so you became strong," Marguerite said softly. "So strong that you forgot that strength also lies in allowing yourself to feel." Edward finally looked at her, and in those blue-grey eyes was a pain so deep it made Marguerite's heart ache. "Feeling hurts too much. Living without feeling hurts even more," she replied, just in quieter ways. They stood there among the roses that survived the winter, two strangers united by vows but separated by invisible walls. And Marguerite realized that this moment was a crack, small, fragile, but a crack nonetheless. An opportunity to begin to tear down, stone by stone, the walls Edward had built around himself. Winter came to Ravencross like a relentless tyrant. Snow covered the mountains and fields, and the wind howled through the towers like lost souls. But inside the castle something was changing, so slow and subtle it was barely perceptible, like ice melting drop by drop. Edward began to seek Marguerite out, not just to fulfill duties, but to talk. Brief practical conversations about governance and strategy, but conversations nonetheless. He asked her opinion on complex disputes, consulted her on matters of civil justice, and occasionally, very occasionally, he spoke of things that had nothing to do with ruling. "My mother used to say that winter was the season of reflection," he said one night, as they watched the snow fall from the window of their shared chambers. "That only in the white silence can we hear our true thoughts." "She sounds like she was a wise woman," Marguerite replied. "She was." A pause. "She would have liked you." It was only 5 words, but they carried immense weight. It was the first time Edward had suggested she meant something beyond a political agreement, something beyond a duty to be fulfilled. Marguerite discovered more about the king through small gestures and revealing silences. She discovered he secretly visited the families of soldiers killed in service, ensuring their widows and children never went without. She discovered he kept an extensive library full of treatises on philosophy and history, and that he read late at night when he couldn't sleep. She discovered he had nightmares, waking up in the dark, tense and alert, as if he were still on battlefields. One night, Marguerite woke to Edward's sudden movement beside her. He was sitting up in bed, breathing heavily, sweat on his brow despite the cold. Without thinking, she touched his arm. "It's just a dream." Edward looked at her, disoriented for a moment. Then his face closed off again, the mask returning to its place. "Forgive me. I did not mean to wake you. Do you speak of battles?" "Ah," she asked gently. "In the nightmares." He hesitated, and Marguerite thought he wouldn't answer. Then his low voice cut through the dark. "I speak of the night my father died. Always the same scene. The Scots emerging from the mist. The sound of swords. His last look at me. I was 22 and I wasn't there to protect him. I was 3 days away, dealing with an insignificant rebellion while he died alone. Marguerite understood something fundamental about Edward then. He hadn't become hard simply by choice but by necessity. He had turned himself into iron because iron doesn't break, doesn't cry, doesn't fail to protect those it loves. You were not responsible for his death, she said. You could not be everywhere at once. But I should have been there. It was my duty. He looked at his own hands. Since then I have sworn never again to fail to protect what is mine. That is why... He stopped, but Marguerite understood what he didn't say. That is why he kept his distance. That is why he didn't allow himself to love. Because love meant the risk of loss, and he had already lost too much. She took his hand, the first time she had dared such intimacy. Strength is not in never failing, Edward. It is in continuing to stand even when one fails. He looked at her hand on his, as if he didn't know what to do with that simple gesture of comfort. Finally his fingers closed around hers, hesitantly, awkwardly, but genuinely. They stayed like that for long minutes in the dark and the silence, two wounded hearts slowly learning that perhaps they didn't have to heal alone. Spring arrived, bringing with it the smell of damp earth and promises of renewal. The fields around Ravencross began to awaken from their winter sleep, and with them, something inside the castle also began to bloom. Marguerite noticed subtle changes in Edward. He was still the Iron King in public, implacable, decisive, feared, but in private with her he was beginning to set the armor aside. Not completely, not all at once, but in small moments of vulnerability that she had learned to value more than any grand romantic gesture. He began to seek her out, not just when necessary, but because he seemed to desire her company. He took her riding in the mountains, showing her the places he loved, cliffs where one could see the entire kingdom, secret clearings where deer grazed without fear. And he talked about his childhood, about the war years, about the dreams he had when he was young that reality had crushed. I wanted to be a scholar, he confessed one day as they rested by a stream that sang over stones. I wanted to travel, to see the world, to study at foreign universities. But my father died, and the throne fell on me like a burden that could not be refused. You can still be a scholar, Marguerite said. A wise king rules better than a merely strong king. Edward looked at her with an expression she had learned to recognize, admiration mixed with surprise, as if he still couldn't believe he had found someone who understood him. How did you become so wise, Lady Marguerite? By watching, by listening, and by learning from a man who tries to hide his heart behind iron, but who lets more show through than he imagines. Something changed in Edward's gaze then. He moved closer, and for the first time he kissed her not out of duty but out of desire. Their slow, almost hesitant kiss, as if he were rediscovering something he had forgotten. That intimacy could be more than a transaction. That touch could mean connection, not just obligation. When they pulled apart, Marguerite saw something in his eyes that made her heart race. Not love yet. Edward was too cautious to allow himself to love so quickly, but the beginning of something deep and true. In the weeks that followed, their relationship evolved from respectful cordiality to something warmer, more intimate. Edward began to share not only his thoughts but his fears. He spoke of the weight of the crown, of the decisions that haunted him, of the men he had ordered executed who haunted his nights. Sometimes I wonder if I have become the kind of man my father would be proud of, he said one night, or if I have only turned into the tyrant everyone says I am. Marguerite held his face between her hands, forcing him to look at her. Tyrants do not question themselves. Tyrants do not lose sleep thinking about the consequences of their actions. You are hard because the world taught you that you need to be. But you are not cruel. There is a difference. How can you be so sure? Because I have seen your kindness when you think no one is looking. I've seen how you treat the soldiers' widows. I've seen how you forgave that young knight who failed in his watch. I have seen the man behind the armor, Edward, and he is far better than you yourself believe him to be. For the first time since they had met, Marguerite saw tears in Edward's eyes. He didn't let them fall, he probably didn't know how, but they were there, proof that the iron was finally yielding to the warmth. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his voice hoarse. I don't know how to let someone in. I don't know how to love, Marguerite completed softly. No one knows, Edward. We just feel and hope it's enough. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was shifting beneath his feet. And Marguerite knew in that moment that she had broken through the walls. She had reached the heart he had tried to protect for so long. The iron was learning to feel again. May brought warmth, and with it, news that would shake Edward and Marguerite's world to its foundations. A messenger arrived at Ravencross on a hot afternoon, carrying a letter sealed with red wax. Edward read it in silence, his face gradually turning paler. When he finished, he remained motionless for so long that Marguerite feared he had turned to stone. "Edward?" she called gently. "What has happened?" He handed her the letter without a word. Marguerite read it quickly and felt her own blood run cold. A young man named Thomas Blackwood had arrived at court, claiming to be the king's bastard son. He was 19 years old and brought with him letters from a woman named Cecily Blackwood, dead 2 years prior, which confirmed his lineage. "Cecily," Edward murmured, and there was so much weight in that name that Marguerite felt as if she had been struck. "So I knew her 20 years ago. We were young. I loved her." The words fell between them like stones in a bottomless well. Marguerite felt a pang of something she recognized as jealousy, but stronger was the compassion, because she could see in Edward's expression that this love had been real, deep, and probably the last time he had allowed himself to feel before turning to iron. "What happened?" she asked. "She was a blacksmith's daughter. My father forbade the relationship. He said I had a greater destiny than marrying a commoner." Edward closed his eyes. "I obeyed. Like a coward, I obeyed. And she disappeared. I never heard from her again. And now there is a son," Marguerite said, more to herself than to him. "An heir." "A bastard," Edward corrected bitterly. "One who could destroy the stability of the kingdom. The lords already question my succession, because we have no legitimate heirs. If I recognize him, it will cause chaos. If I reject him—" He stopped, swallowing with difficulty. "If I reject him, I will be failing her again. Failing Cecily. Failing the son I never knew I had." Marguerite felt her heart break, not from jealousy, but from understanding. This was Edward's worst nightmare. Failing to protect, failing to do what was right, trapped between duty and heart once more. "You must meet him," she said finally. "Before you make any decision, you must meet your son." Edward looked at her with something close to disbelief. "You are not furious? Hurt?" "I am many things," Marguerite admitted honestly. "But above all, I am by your side. This was before me, Edward. And if there is a young man who needs guidance, who needs to know his father, then that must happen." "You are extraordinary," Edward said, his voice breaking slightly. "I do not deserve your kindness." "It is not kindness," she replied. "It is love, and love means facing storms together, not just enjoying the sunny days." Thomas Blackwood arrived 3 days later. He was tall, with brown hair and eyes that were undeniably Edward's, the same blue-gray, the same intensity. But where Edward was hard, Thomas had a kindness. Where Edward was closed off, Thomas smiled easily. "Your Majesty," he said, kneeling before Edward, "I did not come to claim a throne or title. I came only to meet the man my mother loved until her last breath." Edward raised him up, studying the young man's face as if trying to find traces of Cecily in it. Was she happy?" "She was," Thomas replied. "She married a good man who raised me as his son, but she always spoke of you. She said you were the great love of her life, but that she understood your choice. She said that kings do not have the luxury of following their hearts." Tears ran down Edward's face, the first Marguerite had ever seen him shed. He pulled Thomas into an embrace, and there in the throne room of Ravencross, the Iron King cried for a lost love and a son found too late. Marguerite watched from a distance, her own heart broken and mended at the same time, because this was what Edward needed, not just her love, but the healing of old wounds, the forgiveness he never knew he needed to seek. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. Thomas was not a threat, he was a gift. He was intelligent but humble, strong but gentle, and slowly, very slowly, Edward began to allow himself to be a father, something he never thought he would have the chance to be. Marguerite and Thomas developed their own relationship. He called her "my queen" with genuine respect, and she saw in him not a rival, but a stepson she could help guide. "Thank you," Edward said to Marguerite one night, "for accepting him, for not forcing me to choose between the past and the present." "There is no choice to be made," she replied. "Family doesn't exclude, it expands. And Thomas is part of you, therefore he is part of us." Edward kissed her then deeply and passionately, and Marguerite knew that something fundamental had changed. He was no longer afraid to feel, no longer hiding behind walls. He was finally allowing himself to live fully. The weeks following Thomas's arrival were complex. The court buzzed with rumors and speculation. Some lords saw the young bastard as a threat to stability, others a political opportunity, and few, very few, saw simply what he was, a young man trying to find his place in a world that did not expect him. Marguerite watched it all with growing concern. She saw how Edward was torn, wanting to protect Thomas, but also aware that officially recognizing him could destabilize the kingdom. And she saw how that tension was eroding the progress they had made. It was Lord Edmund who brought the issue formally to the council. Majesty, the young Blackwood cannot remain at court indefinitely without his position being defined. The vassals demand clarity. Edward looked at Margery, and she saw in his gaze a silent plea for help. She nodded almost imperceptibly, then stood up, the first time she had taken the floor in the council without being asked. "My lords," she began, her voice clear and firm, "I understand your concerns, but allow me to present a different perspective. Thomas Blackwood is not a threat, he is an asset. He is an educated, capable, loyal young man. We could send him as an ambassador, or appoint him commander of one of the border fortresses. His lineage, even unlegitimized, carries weight. We could use that to our advantage instead of fearing it." Sir Geoffrey considered her words. "The Queen speaks wisely, but what of the matter of succession?" "The succession," Margery said, keeping her voice steady though she felt her cheeks burn, "is not an immediate concern. There is still time." She did not mention what everyone knew, that after months of marriage there was still no legitimate heir. She did not mention the nights she prayed that her womb would finally carry life. Edward rose then, his presence filling the room. "The Queen is correct. Thomas will be recognized as my son, but not as my heir. He will be named Lord of Thornmoor and commander of the southern garrison. Those who have objections may bring them directly to me." The tone was final, the decision made, and Margery felt a wave of relief. Edward had found a path that honored both his heart and his responsibility. But that night, alone in their chambers, Edward's mask finally fell. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. "I failed her," he said, his voice hoarse. "I failed Cecily when I abandoned her. I fail Thomas now by not being able to give him all he deserves. And I fail you. You do not fail me," Margery interrupted, kneeling before him. "Edward, look at me." When he raised his eyes, she saw in them a pain so deep it made her heart contract. "You do not fail me because we do not have children yet. That will come when God wills it. And you do not fail Thomas, you are giving him a place, a position of honor. That is more than most bastards receive. But it is not enough. Nothing will ever be enough for you, because you carry the weight of all your past decisions as if they were stones on your shoulders." She held his face between her hands. "Edward, you must learn to forgive yourself. You must learn that you did the best you could in the circumstances you had. And that has to be enough." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were his only anchor in a stormy sea. And Margery realized something fundamental. She had become not just his queen, but his confidant, his strength, his true partner. And he in turn had become the center of her world in a way she had never anticipated when she accepted that arranged marriage. "I love you," Edward said suddenly, the words tumbling out like a torn confession. "I don't know when it happened. I don't know how, but I love you. And it terrifies me, because now I have something more to lose." Margery felt tears burn her eyes. "Then we will be terrified together, because I love you too, Edward. I love you with all your hardness and all your hidden tenderness. I love you with your fears and your nightmares. I love you whole." They kissed then, and it was different from all the kisses before. It was a promise, a surrender, two hearts finally allowing themselves to be completely vulnerable with one another. And when Edward laid her gently on the bed, when he loved her with a tenderness he had never shown before, Margery knew they had crossed a line. They were no longer strangers united by duty. They were lovers, companions, two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely place. The Iron King had learned to feel, and in the process, he had found something far more valuable than any kingdom. He had found love. Summer brought scorching heat, and with it a fever that spread through Ravencross like fire in a dry forest. It began in the barracks, then spread to the nearby villages and finally reached the castle. Margery woke one morning feeling strangely weak. She ignored it, attributing it to the heat, to the fatigue from the long council meetings. But by noon she could barely stand. By nightfall she was burning with fever. Edward found her collapsed in their chambers, semi-conscious, her body trembling despite the summer heat. The panic that crossed his face was something Margery would never forget. It was pure terror, the same expression he must have had as a boy watching his mother die. "No," he said, scooping her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "Not you. Please, not you." The 3 days that followed were a nightmare. Margery drifted between consciousness and delirium, sometimes waking to see Edward at her side, his face etched with fear and exhaustion. He did not leave her room. He refused to sleep, to eat, to leave her for even an instant. "You must rest, Your Majesty," Beatrice pleaded. "You cannot help her if you fall ill yourself." "I will not leave her alone," Edward answered, his voice rough with fatigue and emotion. "Not again. Never again." In her moments of lucidity, Margery saw the absolute devotion in his eyes. She saw how he bathed her face with cool cloths, how he held her hand even when she didn't have the strength to squeeze back, how he prayed, this man who rarely prayed, with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "Promise me," she murmured once, her voice weak. "Promise me you will live even if I—" "Do not say that," Edward cut in, his voice breaking. "Do not dare to leave me, Marguerite. Not now that I have finally learned to live again. Not now that I have something to live for. Edward." "No." He pressed his lips against her feverish forehead. "Fight. For me, for us, for everything we still have to build together. Fight." And she fought, because she loved him too much to leave him, because there were promises still unfulfilled, because the life they had begun to build was too precious to abandon. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke. Marguerite woke up weak but lucid, and the first thing she saw was Edward, sitting beside her, holding her hand, his eyes closed in prayer or exhaustion. She couldn't tell. "Edward," she called, her voice just a whisper. He opened his eyes immediately, and what she saw in them made her heart overflow. It was absolute love, total devotion, relief so deep it manifested in tears that finally ran freely down his face. "Thank God," he said, his voice hoarse. "Thank God." He embraced her then, gentle so as not to hurt her, but firm enough for her to feel how he had trembled with fear of losing her. And Marguerite, even in her weakness, wrapped her arms around him, offering comfort to the man who had refused to let her face death alone. "I thought I would lose you," he confessed, his face hidden in her shoulder. "And I realized that if I lost you, I would lose myself as well. Because you are not just my queen, Marguerite. You are my soul. You are everything." "I am here," she murmured, running her weak fingers through his hair. "I am here, my love. And I am not going anywhere." In the weeks that followed, as Marguerite regained her strength, Edward never left her side. He carried her to the garden so she could get some sun. He read to her in the afternoons. He told her stories from his childhood, stories he had never shared with anyone. And slowly, as she recovered physically, they became even closer emotionally. "Almost losing you taught me something," Edward said one day, as they rested on the stone bench under the apple tree in his mother's garden. "It taught me that living in fear of loss is to waste the time we have. Therefore, I will no longer live in fear, Marguerite. I will live by loving you completely every day as if it were a gift, because it is." Marguerite smiled, her hands intertwined with his. "And I will love you the same way. Without reservations, without fear, completely." It was a promise and a vow more true than those they had exchanged in the cathedral months before, because those had been words dictated by tradition. These were feelings born of experience, of near loss, of love earned through time, patience, and the courage to be vulnerable. The iron had not just softened. It had been transformed into something new, still strong, but now also capable of tenderness, of love, of everything that makes life worth living. Autumn arrived, painting the mountains gold and red, and with it news that would make Marguerite and Edward face their greatest challenge yet. Reports came of Scottish movements on the northern border. Not a full invasion, but enough raids to cause alarm. And with this news came renewed pressure from the lords. "We need an heir," Lord Edmund said in council, his voice respectful but firm. "If your majesty falls in battle without a clear succession," he didn't need to finish. Everyone knew what would happen. Civil war, chaos, the kingdom Edward had built crumbling in power disputes. Marguerite felt the weight of those words like a physical blow. It had been over a year of marriage, and still there was no child. She prayed every night, consulted wise women, did everything she could, but her womb remained empty. And now that failure, because that was how she was beginning to see it, was becoming not just a personal pain but a matter of state. Edward ended the meeting abruptly, and later sought Marguerite out. He found her in the walled garden, sitting on the bench under the apple tree, silent tears running down her face. "Marguerite," he said gently, sitting beside her. "I have failed you," she whispered. "In everything that matters, I have failed." "No," Edward replied firmly, turning her to face him. "Never say that. You have not failed me in anything. But there is no heir. And now, with war on the horizon, then there will be war. And I will fight knowing I have a reason to return you. Heir or not, you are my reason for living, Marguerite. Not your womb, not your ability to give me children, but you, your mind, your heart, your soul." She wanted to believe him, but the pain was too deep. "Cecily gave you a son." Edward's expression hardened. "Cecily was part of my past. A past I love and honor, but a past nonetheless. You are my present and my future. And if God wills to give us children, it will be a blessing. If not," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "then we will have Thomas. He can be legitimized. He can be named heir. But the Lords will get used to it, or they will find a new king." There was steel in his voice now. But I will not sacrifice our happiness on the expectations of others, Marguerite. I already did that once with Cecily, and it almost destroyed my humanity. I will not do it again." In that moment, something shifted in Marguerite. She realized she had been carrying guilt that was not hers, internalizing pressures she should not accept. Yes, heirs were important, but they were not everything. And Edward loved her regardless of her ability to conceive them. "I love you," she said, touching his face, "and whatever future awaits us, we will face it together." "Together," Edward agreed, kissing her softly. It was 2 weeks later that Marguerite realized her monthly bleeding was late. She didn't dare to hope. She had been disappointed before. But when the delay stretched, when she began to feel morning nausea, when her breasts became tender, she finally allowed herself to believe. She called the midwife discreetly. The older woman examined her carefully, then smiled. "Congratulations, Your Majesty. You carry life." Marguerite couldn't hold back the tears, tears of joy, of relief, of gratitude, but above all tears because this confirmed something she already knew, that her love and Edward's was real, deep, capable of creating new life. She waited until the evening to tell him. She found him in his private chambers, studying military maps by candlelight. When she entered, he looked up and smiled, that smile he reserved only for her, which transformed his severe face into something almost youthful. "Edward," she said, approaching, "I have news." Something in her tone made him immediately alert. "What has happened?" "Nothing bad." She took his hand and pressed it against her still flat stomach. "Everything very, very good. We are going to have a child." Edward froze completely, processing the words. Then his expression transformed. Surprise, joy, fear, hope, all at once. "A child?" "A child," she confirmed, smiling through her tears. Edward swept her up into his arms, spinning her around, gently mindful of the precious life she carried, and laughed. Truly laughed. A deep, genuine sound that Marguerite had never heard from him before. It was the laugh of a man who was finally allowing himself to be completely happy. "You have given me everything," he said, setting her gently back on her feet. "Love, purpose, joy, and now this. How can I ever be worthy of you?" "By being exactly who you are," she replied. "The man I love, the father our child will need, the king that Blackmore deserves." They stood like that, embracing, their foreheads touching, two hearts beating in unison, united not just by vows or duty, but by true and deep love. And in the silence of that moment, both made silent promises. Edward to be the father he never had the chance to be for Thomas, Marguerite to raise their child in love and wisdom. The future was uncertain. There was war on the horizon, challenges to face, hardships still to come. But they would face them together, united by something stronger than steel, more durable than stone. Love that had been tested, proven, and had emerged stronger from every trial. Winter arrived, bringing snow and also clarity. Marguerite's belly grew, a gentle curve that became more pronounced each week, a constant reminder of the life flourishing within her. Edward was protective to the point of obsession. He insisted she rest, that she avoid exertion, that she eat enough. It was touching and occasionally exasperating. "Edward, I am pregnant, not dying," she said one day when he tried to stop her from attending the council. "That is exactly why I must protect you," he replied, his face serious. "You and our child are too precious, and we will be fine, but I must continue to participate in governing. Our child needs to see that their mother is a queen, not just in title, but in action." Edward eventually relented, but he never ceased to be attentive, always close, always vigilant. And Marguerite loved him even more for this devotion, even when it smothered her. Thomas had settled in well at Thornmoor. He visited often and had developed a genuine relationship with Marguerite. One day he found her alone in the garden and sat beside her in comfortable silence. "Are you worried about the baby?" he asked finally. "A little," Marguerite admitted. "Not about the baby itself, but about what it represents." "It changes everything, Thomas. It changes your position. It changes nothing that matters," he interrupted gently. "Marguerite, may I call you that? I never came here expecting to inherit. I came to know my father, and I found not only a father, but a family that welcomed me when they had no reason to. This baby is not my rival. It is my brother or sister, and I will love them as such." Marguerite felt tears burn her eyes. Pregnancy hormones, perhaps, but also genuine emotion. "Thank you, Thomas, for your kindness, your generosity. Your father is lucky to have you." "We are all lucky to have each other," he replied, smiling. As spring approached, Edward made important decisions. He convened a special council meeting and announced changes that would make history in Blackmore. "My lords," he said, his voice firm and clear, "our kingdom was built on military strength, and that has served us well. But to prosper, not just survive, we need more. We need balanced justice, thriving agriculture, education beyond the nobility. Therefore, I am establishing these reforms." He outlined plans that Margery and he had discussed for months: tax reductions to encourage trade, the building of schools in larger towns, reform of the justice system to ensure fair trials even for the poorest, investment in irrigation and agricultural techniques. Some lords protested. Change always meets resistance, but Edward was relentless. "These reforms will happen, with your support or without it, but I prefer with it." It was characteristic of Edward, offering a choice that wasn't really a choice, and it worked. The lords, even the most conservative, yielded to his determination. Margery watched with pride. This was the king she always knew he could be, not just a warrior but a wise ruler. And she knew her influence had helped bring him to this point, just as his love had transformed her. One night, lying in bed, Edward's hand resting gently on Margery's belly where the baby was kicking, she said, "You are building a legacy, Edward, something greater than wars and conquests. You are building a future where our child can grow up in peace and prosperity." "Our children," Edward corrected, smiling, "because this will only be the first. You have given me so much. I want to give you a large and happy family." Margery laughed. "First, let's see how this one goes, my ambitious king." But in her heart she dreamed too. She dreamed of children running through the halls of Ravencross, filling those cold stones with laughter and life. She dreamed of a kingdom at peace, prosperous, where justice and mercy walked hand in hand. She dreamed of growing old beside Edward, watching his hair turn completely silver, watching his wrinkles deepen not from worry, but from smiles. They were bold dreams for a time of uncertainty. But if there was one thing Margery had learned in the last year, it was that bold dreams were the only ones worth chasing. May brought warmth and with it contractions. Margery was in the garden when she felt the first one, a wave of pain that made her double over, hands clutching the belly where her child was preparing to enter the world. "Call the midwife," she said to Edith, keeping her voice steady despite the fear that was beginning to grip her heart. "And call the king." What followed was a blur of pain and effort. Margery was taken to the royal chambers, where the midwife and her assistants were already preparing everything. Edward appeared, his face pale, and tried to enter. "Majesty, it is not proper," the midwife began, but Edward ignored her completely, going straight to Margery. "I will not leave you alone in this," he said, taking her hand. "If you want me to stay, I will stay." Margery squeezed his fingers. "Stay." And he stayed. Through hours of labor, through pain that made Margery scream, through moments when she thought she couldn't go on, Edward was there, holding her hand, wiping her sweaty face, whispering words of encouragement. "You are the strongest woman I know," he would say. "You can do this." Just a little longer, when finally, after hours that felt like days, the sharp cry of a baby filled the room, Margery collapsed, exhausted but triumphant. The midwife lifted the child, cleaning it quickly. "It's a girl, Your Majesties," she announced, smiling. "A beautiful, healthy girl, a girl." Margery felt tears of joy run down her face. Edward looked at the baby with an expression of absolute wonder, as if he was seeing a miracle, which indeed he was. "May I?" he asked, holding out his hands. The midwife placed the carefully bundled baby in Edward's arms. He held her with a gentleness that completely contrasted with his image as the Iron King, studying every detail of the red, scrunched-up face. "She is perfect," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "She is absolutely perfect." He brought the baby to Margery, placing her in her arms. And when Margery looked at her daughter, eyes still closed, tiny fists, red hair like her own, she felt a love so intense it hurt. "What shall we call her?" Edward asked. "Eleanor," Margery said without hesitation. It was her mother's name, and it felt right. "Eleanor of Blackmore." "Eleanor," Edward repeated, smiling. "Our little Eleanor." But the joy was tempered by worry when days later it became clear that having a girl as the firstborn presented issues they had not fully anticipated. In a council meeting, Lord Edmund raised the question everyone was thinking but hesitant to voice. "Majesty, by the current law of succession, women cannot inherit the throne of Blackmore. This means that Thomas Blackwood would be next in the line of succession." Edward was silent for a long moment. Then he looked at Margery, and she saw in him the same determination that characterized him. "Then we will change the law." The shock in the hall was palpable. "Majesty," Sir Geoffrey began carefully, "this is unprecedented." "Many things we have done have been unprecedented," Edward cut in, "and all of them have strengthened our kingdom. My daughter is intelligent, I can already see it. She will be raised to rule. And when the time comes, she will be queen in her own right, not just a consort. But the lords will get used to it, or," his tone turned dangerous, They will find that displeasing the king has consequences. It was bold, revolutionary even, but Edward succeeded. Through a combination of intimidation and persuasion, by reminding the lords of all he had done for Blackmore, he changed the law. Eleanor would be recognized as the legitimate heir. Thomas, when he heard, came to Ravencross immediately. Margery was in the garden with Eleanor sleeping in her arms when he arrived. "I came to ensure there are no misunderstandings," he said without preamble. "I swear fealty to Eleanor. When she is queen, I will be her most faithful servant. I have and never have had ambitions for the throne." Margery looked at him with deep gratitude. "Thank you, Thomas, for your kindness, your honor. Eleanor will be lucky to have a brother like you, and I will be lucky to have a sister," he replied, smiling at the baby, "and a family that accepted me when they didn't have to." In that moment, Margery clearly saw the future she and Edward were building. It wasn't just about bloodlines and successions. It was about chosen family, about love that transcended blood, about a kingdom ruled not by fear but by justice and compassion. The Iron King had not just softened, he had transformed into something much greater. And with that transformation, he would transform his kingdom as well. 5 years passed like the pages of a precious book, too quickly, but leaving indelible marks. Eleanor had grown from a baby into a curious child with red hair and the blue-grey eyes she had inherited from her father. She was intelligent, talkative, and absolutely adored books and horses in equal measure. Margery had had 2 more children in the following years. First William, then little Cecily, named in honor of Edward's first love. Far from being an insult, Margery had proposed the name, understanding that woman deserved to be remembered, not with pain, but with gratitude for the son she had given the world. Ravencross had changed. The corridors that once echoed only with the steps of guards now resonated with the laughter of children. The walled garden had expanded, with a section dedicated to the children where they could plant their own flowers. Edward's reforms had taken root. Schools were operating in 6 towns, roads had been repaired, the justice system reformed. And Thomas had married a noblewoman from the south, Isabella de Montfort, and they had 3 children of their own. He visited often, and his children played with Eleanor, William, and Cecily like the cousins they were in all but legal documents. It was June again, June 24th to be exact. 5 years since Margery and Edward had first exchanged vows. And Edward had planned something that surprised even Margery. "A vow renewal?" she asked when he told her. "Why?" "Because our first vows were given out of duty," he said, taking her hands. "And I want to make new vows. These given out of love, out of choice, out of everything we have become to one another." The ceremony was intimate, just family and the closest friends. It was not a political spectacle, but a personal celebration. They stood before Bishop Anselm at the same altar, where they had married 5 years before, but everything was different now. Edward, looking into Margery's eyes, spoke with a voice that was firm but thick with emotion. "Margery, when I met you, I was a man of iron, incapable of feeling, terrified of vulnerability. You taught me that true strength lies in opening one's heart, not closing it. You taught me to live, not just exist. You taught me to love. And for that, I renew my vows not out of obligation, but out of choice. I choose you today, I will choose you tomorrow, and I will choose you every day God gives me. You are my queen, my companion, my soul. And I love you more than words can express." Tears ran freely down Margery's face when it was her turn to speak. "Edward, when I agreed to marry you, I did it for duty. But staying with you was a choice. Loving you was a choice. And every day I choose you again. You gave me not just a crown, but purpose. Not just security, but partnership. Not just respect, but true and deep love. I promise to continue by your side, through all the storms and all the sunny days, through all the joys and sorrows. Because you are my heart, and without you I am not whole." When they kissed, it was under the tearful gazes of all present, because everyone there knew the journey they had traveled, from strangers forced to marry to devoted lovers, from a political transaction to a true love story. The feast that followed was a joyous celebration. Children ran between the tables. Music filled the hall. And for the first time in perhaps decades, Ravencross knew true happiness. Later that night, when the children were finally asleep and the castle quieted, Edward and Margery stood in the walled garden under the stars. She rested in his arms, and they watched in comfortable silence, the kind of silence only truly connected couples share. "Do you have any regrets?" Edward asked suddenly. Margery turned to look at him. "None, and you?" "Only one," he said, touching her face gently. "That I did not know your heart sooner, that I wasted months building walls when I could have been building bridges. But we got here," she said, "and the journey made us appreciate the destination even more." "Yes," he agreed, kissing her softly, Yes, we did. And they stood like that. Two hearts that had found each other in the most unlikely place. Two kingdoms that had become one. Two lives intertwined so completely, it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The Iron King had learned to feel. The Lady of Ashford had become a queen not just by title, but by right earned through wisdom, courage, and love. And together, they were building a legacy that would last far beyond their lifetimes. A kingdom where justice and mercy ruled side by side, where women could inherit crowns, where family was defined not just by blood but by choice. The stars shone over Ravencross, silent witnesses to a complete transformation. And somewhere in the shadows of the garden, where the winter roses still bloomed, one could almost hear a whisper of approval, perhaps from Edward's mother, perhaps from Cecily, perhaps from the universe itself celebrating that love. After all, always finds a way. 20 years later, 1412 AD, the throne room of Ravencross was filled to capacity. Eleanor, now 25, was being formally crowned as Queen Regent, taking on more responsibilities as Edward, at 57, gradually passed power to his daughter. She was stunning in her royal robes, all the intelligence and strength of her mother, all the determination and justice of her father. And at her side was her own husband, a prince from a neighboring kingdom, whom she had chosen not for politics but for love. Margaery watched from the gallery, now 41, still beautiful despite the expression lines around her eyes, lines of laughter, of motherly concern, of a life fully lived. Edward was at her side, his hair now completely silver, but his eyes still holding that spark when he looked at her. "Are you proud?" Margaery whispered. "Beyond words," Edward replied, taking her hand. "She will be a magnificent queen, better than I ever was." "She learned from the best," Margaery said, squeezing his fingers. Down below, Thomas also watched, now 39, his own grown children by his side. He applauded when Eleanor took her oath, and the pride on his face was genuine. He had become a trusted advisor to Eleanor, just as he had been a loyal servant to Edward. William, now 19, stood beside his sister as her right hand and future military commander. And little Cecily, at 17, was already showing a talent for diplomacy that would make her a valuable ambassador. After the ceremony, the family gathered in the walled garden, that space that had witnessed so many important moments in their lives. Edward had expanded it over the years, adding a special section with Margaery's favorite flowers. "Grandmother, tell us the story again," asked one of Thomas's grandchildren. "About how the Iron King learned to smile," Margaery laughed, pulling the child onto her lap. "Well, once upon a time there was a king who had forgotten how to feel joy." She began to tell, modifying the story to be appropriate for a child, but capturing the essence, how love can transform even the hardest hearts, how vulnerability is strength, not weakness, how chosen family is as valuable as family by blood. Edward watched, smiling, that smile that had become frequent over the years, transforming his face from severe to warm. He looked around at his extended family, children, grandchildren, Thomas and his children, loyal friends who had become family, and felt a profound gratitude. He thought of the 22-year-old who had lost his father and sworn never to feel pain again. He thought of the 37-year-old man who had married Margaery out of political necessity, determined to keep his emotional distance. And he thought of how he would have lost all this love, all this joy, all this full life, if he had remained shut behind his iron walls. "Thank you," he whispered to Margaery as she finished the story. "For what?" she asked. "For everything. For not giving up on me. For teaching me to live again. For giving me this life." Margaery leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "We saved each other, my love. That is the truth." And perhaps it was. Perhaps true love is always like that. Two people, each carrying wounds and fears, choosing day after day to heal together, to grow together, to build something beautiful from what began as a pragmatic arrangement. The sun was setting over the Black Mountains, painting the sky gold and rose. And in the garden of Ravencross, surrounded by family and love, Edward and Margaery watched, hands intertwined, hearts united, knowing their legacy was not just in the prosperous kingdom they would leave behind, but in the love they had proven was possible. The Iron King had learned to feel, and in that feeling, he discovered that true strength lies not in never breaking, but in allowing oneself to be mended by love. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, a certainty hung over. All gathered there, that love, true and patient, can tear down walls that armies never could. It can turn iron into gold. It can create, from two strangers forced to marry, a love story that spans generations.